Are you an empath? Hello there. My name is Quinn. Now, about 8 years ago, I was diagnosed with a condition called Hyperempathy Syndrome. Since then, I have spent a lot of time looking around online trying to learn more about it, but I haven't been able to find much information on the subject. Recently, however, I've had a number of articles and videos and plugs pop up detailing being an empath, or a healer, or a reader, or a carer, etc. The majority of which end up just being advertisements for books or online courses, but all of them define those terms, empath, healer, etc., with pretty much the same characteristics and traits that I would attribute to hyperempathy syndrome. For example, some of the things listed in those articles were being highly sensitive to emotion, absorbing other people's emotions, avoiding people, especially crowds, developing agoraphobia, introversion, supporting, caring for other people more than yourself, ignoring your own problems and pains, secretive and avoidant behaviours, and being able to tell if someone's lying. Other claims go into things like loving or being connected with nature, stars, spiritual, or even psychic. One article about hyperempathy or being an empath was by a psychiatrist that equated it to being an emotional vampire, and mentioned people with narcissism and sociopathy, calling them monsters. This may just be my perspective, but if you're a psychiatrist and you're referring to people with personality disorders as monsters, you probably shouldn't be a psychiatrist. And it turned out the article was just a buzzword-filled advert for their book. So, anyway. Another recurring topic was that empaths can't stand violence or depictions of violence, none of which really related to the actual condition, which seems like it's been surrounded by a lot of myths and a lot of stigma. So, because of all this, I decided to make this video and try to explain what this condition really is. So, hyperempathy syndrome, or hyperempathy disorder, depending on where you source it from, is difficult to get much information on for a couple of reasons. The main reason is if you try and look it up, you get all the results that I seem to get. Like, are you an empath? 5 things that empaths do, 11 secrets that empaths won't tell you. And it's not really the way that those articles portray them, in a way that's magical or spiritual or astrological. Some even described it as a learned skill, akin to something they gain from unlocking a certain chakra, for example. Now, you can certainly learn to interpret and understand your emotions better, as well as other people's, and people normally have a level of empathy which can vary from person to person to various degrees. However, what most of these articles seem to refer to as a form of being an empath is what we'd call being a person with hyperempathy. That said, people can still have a very high level of empathy and suffer the same kinds of challenges. Now, I don't mean to diminish that. I just want to clarify between the terms and what they mean. One big cause for that is that empath is a term originating in science fiction. It's quite old, but I suppose one of the better known ones would be like Mantis from Guardians of the Galaxy. They're an empath. Mr. Spock has the abilities of an empath. These powers are fictional, but the term is popular and more commonly used, so I dare say a lot of the people I've seen who have these extreme levels of empathy are probably mistaking the terms and getting a lot of misinformation because of that. Now, the second reason information on hyperempathy is hard to find is that it's reasonably rare. At the very least, it's certainly not common. In the past, 8 or so years, trolling through the internet since I've found out about it, I've encountered all of 5 people who genuinely have the condition. So, it's quite rare. And so there's not much research on it, and the research that has been done on it is fairly new. What I'm sharing, or hoping to share if I get this right, is the best of what genuine information I could find about it, and some insight from my own personal experience. Now, it usually gets grouped in with autism diagnosis, and it is related to it, and it often appears in conjunction with things like Asperger's syndrome and sometimes borderline personality disorder and other autistic spectrum or personality disorders. If you go through the DSM, which from memory is the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual of Mental Disorders, it is classified as just a personality disorder, NOS, or not otherwise specified. So it doesn't really have much of its own specific explanation as such, and so it's not something that's terribly easy to get diagnosed in a way, unless you really know something about it or understand it or have managed to find out enough about it on your own to actually go in and ask about it and get some confirmation on it. So yeah, not much is really known about what causes hyperempathy. There was an odd case, I think it was back in 2003, where a woman who suffered brain damage developed it, and another one who had her amygdala removed in surgery for epilepsy developed it. However, most common cause is an excess of mirror neurons in the brain. Now, these are responsible for empathy, and I try and explain that as best I can by, well, using copy pasta from Wikipedia, citation needed, just because it actually sums it up reasonably well what a mirror neuron is. So, my notes. A mirror neuron is a neuron that fires both when an animal acts and when the animal observes the same action performed by another. Thus, the neuron mirrors the behavior of the other, as though the observer were itself acting. If you know the classic saying, monkey see, monkey do, it's probably older than this, but you could derive that saying from this. So, mirror neurons are responsible for empathy. So, you see someone that's sad, you feel sad, you empathize with them. Most people have that empathy to some degree, and it's normal. It's a normal, involuntary physical reaction. In the case of someone with hyperempathy, though, they have an excess of those neurons, those mirror neurons, a huge excess. They empathize involuntarily, and they take on the emotions of others to an unnaturally extreme degree as a result, often feeling what that other person is feeling more than they are, in addition to their own feelings. So they'll have their own feelings, and then they'll also feel someone else's emotions over the top of it, and then they can combine together to a degree. It's sort of complicated, but I will do my best to try and explain it in my own inept way. For most people who are empaths or hyperempathic, these feelings or stimulation of emotion can be extremely painful, physically painful, and not just like ow, this hurts my feelings, but actually painful. In the same way, probably the best analogy I can give to try and explain this is another sensation, like hearing. You hear something, some music, someone talking to you, and you experience the sensation of sound. Now, if, for example, you had extremely sensitive hearing, that sound would come across as incredibly loud to you, painfully loud even, as if someone was literally just screaming into your ear and it'd hurt. Or another example, sight. You see a blindingly bright light and it hurts your eyes. The point is, it's a sensation, and if you're extremely sensitive to that sensation, experiencing it can be painful. Now, with that mirroring effect, or feeling the emotions of another, I can give you examples from my own experiences. If I'm around somebody who's happy, I will feel overzealously happy. If I sit with someone who wants a cup of tea, so they ask me for one, and I'll feel that desire for them to have a cup of tea. So I'll feel it strongly, and I'll hastily run off to go and make them a cup of tea, because I'm feeling that desire for them to have tea. Not me specifically, but just that desire, that emotion. Continuing on, if I'm with someone who's sad and crying, I usually end up sitting crying with them, often feeling more sad than they are, but I'm pretty jaded and I don't cry much. Or I could just say that I'm a sad, bitter, twisted old bastard. On that note, I should point out that just because you experience an emotion doesn't necessarily mean that you express it. So, you can feel really, really sad, but still not break down crying. The same mirroring effect also occurs with negative emotions and things. Sadness is a negative emotion, I suppose, relatively. But say, around an angry person, I feel angry. And yeah, I'm around someone who's sad, I feel really sad. If I'm around someone who's in pain, you can actually feel that pain to a degree. I might not be as sensitive as other people in that regard, but it does happen, and I'll go into that a little bit more later. On a positive note, if you're with someone that's experiencing pleasure, for example, if you're intimate with someone and they experience pleasure, if you're hyperempathic or you're just normally very empathic, you will feel that pleasure with great intensity, which is quite nice. So there's that at least. Now, before I go too much further into the, magic psychic power and healing crystals, which this probably sounds like, this isn't some special power. It's a psychological disorder for a reason, or I'm not sure if I should say psychological or psychiatric, because it's not simply mental, it is also physical, because it does have to do with the actual neurons in your brain and how they work. But yes, it is a disorder, and it is a disorder for a reason. There are pros and cons to it, as some people would say, in a lot of those videos and things, and a lot of people who talk about it, some people will say it's like a gift and a curse, but it's not some superpower or otherworldly ability like it's sometimes made out to be. As an example of one of those things, as was listed before, being able to tell when someone's lying, there were a lot of those articles and videos that were saying things like empaths are walking lie detectors. Yes and no to a degree. So if you're hyperempathic, just as an example for that, I suppose, when someone's lying to you, you can very easily feel their insincerity, in the sense that, if you're with a person and they're saying, oh, I like you, I care about you, oh, I love your shirt, but you're mirroring their actual emotions, and their emotions are actually disdain, loathing, and hatred, you can probably figure out that they're bullshitting. But it's not like, suddenly rings in your head like, that's a lie. It doesn't really work like that. But likewise, you can very accurately interpret people's emotions, which was one of the proper clinical tests that they did many, many years ago. And that isn't limited to direct interaction either. So being an empath, being hyperempathic, you can pick up emotions and things a lot more accurately from voices, written words, images, depending on the situation and the expression. So, like, when I'm in a video chat with someone, I can start feeling their emotions or perceiving them really, really accurately. Since it's a perceptual thing, just as, like, I'm sure if there's some hyperempathic people that end up watching this video, they'll be able to start feeling my emotions and emotions that I display because of that perception. They'll be able to pick up on it from my voice and my mannerisms and my facial expressions, everything. It all kind of gets mixed in together, and it's the way that your brain sort of interprets these things. The downside to all of that, though, is that it's extremely psychologically and physically taxing. As I was kind of touching on with the mirror neurons, mental pain can manifest as physical pain, and pain very quickly becomes strenuous and exhausting after a while. Now, that mirroring effect was tested in the only other experiment on hyperempathy that I'm aware of, wherein they anaesthetised a hyperempathic woman's arm, so made her whole arm numb, and they tested it, made sure it was numb. Then they hooked her brain up to a monitor and monitored her brain activity, basically. Then they got her to watch an adjacent patient's arm get pierced with needles to cause that patient pain. From that, the pain receptors for this woman's numbed arm lit up in her brain, indicating that she was feeling genuine physical pain by perceiving it from another person. So it kind of confirmed the theories they had about it, and it was quite an interesting test. But anyway, that's the fun and dandy part about having hyperempathy, or being an empath, if you call it that. You feel everything that you perceive, to an insane degree, good or bad. And given the kind of shitty world that we live in, it's usually more of the bad. And that's in addition to all of your own emotions, which add to the fun little psychosis-inducing mixture. That is, if you actually can still feel your own emotions over the emotions of the people around you, depending on, the severity. So this means people with the disorder, or people who are just highly empathic, often suffer psychological trauma that they have to work out their own coping mechanisms for. As in, for example, avoiding eye contact, avoiding looking at people, avoiding people altogether. They'll usually become quite agoraphobic, and all of those things are symptoms of a lot of personality disorders, which makes it hard to recognize, because if you had those things, you'd probably get diagnosed with something different if you went and saw a professional to specifically get a diagnosis. But all those things, avoiding people, avoiding eye contact, it helps by creating barriers to prevent perceiving other people's emotions, so that they don't feel them and they don't get hurt by them. The other coping method most hyperempathic people learn at a fairly young age is to switch off their emotions, or block everything out, shut down, effectively feel nothing, via psychological script, dissociation, whatever works. Switching off, it gives them a chance to recover and process everything they felt, all of that stimulation and everything. And then when they have recovered, or they start feeling better, or they've processed it, then they can sort of switch back on and go back to feeling everything again. And they kind of have to, because what can happen otherwise is, a lot worse. I mean, during that time, they'll usually be very distant. They probably won't talk. They'll probably go far away from other people, somewhere quiet, just be alone for a while. That seems to be the norm for a lot of people with high empathy, or people who are introverted, things like that. The other thing most hyperempathic people have experienced at some point in their life is what's usually called something like a burnout or blowout, which is like blowing a fuse. So the same sort of thing happens. You shut down, your emotions shut down and everything else, but it's not a voluntary thing. The whole point of switching off or shutting down is to avoid this happening, because switching off, it's a voluntary action. You can choose to feel everything or nothing, and alternate between them as you need to, really. Burning out, however, is it's when that safeguard fails, and when a hyper-empathic person, or if you still prefer to call it an empath, experiences too much emotion or goes through significant psychological trauma, like running too much electricity through a light bulb and making it explode. The result is akin to a severe mental breakdown. Their brain kind of goes like, nope, too much, I'm out. And it's an involuntary defense mechanism, just like your body going into shock or recoiling from a startling pain. Being that involuntary action, however, that person cannot choose to just switch their emotions back on, and they can remain in a chronic mental state for months or years before properly recovering. Most often they'll become completely unresponsive, shut themselves off from all human action, and depending on the person, go through a bunch of other shit caused by that kind of breakdown, which again presents as other things like clinical depression, autistic spectrum disorders, and lots of other mental problems. So yeah, it's somewhat complicated, and there's very little study into it, so information seems pretty limited. At least I haven't been able to find much at all. But probably the easiest way to think of it is that someone with hyperempathy is like a mirror. I'm not sure if that was a cat. It was probably a cat. Anyway. See, someone with hyperempathy is kind of like a mirror. They'll reflect your emotions and your desires, often putting your well-being before their own. And also, kind of like a mirror, they can be very fragile, and it's easy to hurt them unintentionally. I don't mean that in a melodramatic, over-sensitive way. I mean it like if you snapped and screamed at them over some meaningless, trivial thing. They'll understand that it's trivial, but they'll also likely be trying to actively avoid anything like that, because for them it actually hurts, and it's not a choice, it's an involuntary reaction, and they can't just choose to get over it. Same as if you pull a muscle. It hurts, and it continues to hurt for quite a while, and you can't just choose to get over it and have that pain suddenly go away. You can cope with it to an extent, or learn to grit your teeth and bear it, but it doesn't make it stop. And because of that, empaths, or people with hyperempathy, they often tend to avoid other people as best they can, because those things can be incredibly painful for them, and it's not an intentional thing. People don't normally go out of their way to hurt them or anything, and they know that as well, but it's kind of like anything that's painful. People usually tend to avoid it. And that's more or less a rough description, I suppose, summary of hyperempathy syndrome. So, anyway, I hope this has been helpful, and that my explanation wasn't absolutely awful. If you are, or you think you may be hyperempathic, or an empath, and if it's having a negative impact on your life, please consider seeing a proper psychologist or a psychiatrist. And by that I mean one that isn't going to refer to you as a emotional vampire, or some kind of monstrous freak, or whatever. because they might be able to help if you're struggling or having issues. Well, otherwise, I'll be off. It's 2 a.m. in the morning here. I'm on a whole load of prescription amphetamines, and I am exhausted. If anyone's seeing this has any questions, feel free to ask, and I'll try and answer as best I can. Otherwise, bye.